Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to focus upon two hotspots around the world. One is in Israel and the Gaza Strip, and also we're going to talk a little bit about Iran. My guest today is an expert on these topics. Dr. Michael Cairo is a professor of political science, and he's the program director of international affairs at Transylvania University. His most recent book is American Presidents and Israeli Settlements Since 1967. Mike Cairo, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Well, good to see you.
Good to see you. I'll tell you, since the United Nations created Israel and basically Palestine in 1947, and it came online in 1948, it has just been an area of contention. But we're going to solve the problem today, I hope.
I don't know
Somebody
about that.
needs
You're
to.
putting a lot of
That's
expectations on this time period.
I set the bar high.
Yeah.
But let's, if you would, Mike, just spend a couple of minutes on the background and the origins of the conflict, and then we'll move on and talk about what's going on with the peace process and that type of thing.
This is a conflict that is at its base about land and territorial claims. Land that, in essence, during the British Mandate, which took place after World War I in Palestine, was promised to both Palestinians and to Zionist Jews at the time, and land that the United Nations, as you pointed out, after World War II, after 1945, passed a Resolution 181, to partition and essentially share the space. A war broke out in 48-49 after Israel declared its independence. And at the end of that war, you basically have Israel being created. You also have Egypt and Jordan controlling what is today the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Jordan actually controlled East Jerusalem at the time. And the real clincher, the real thing that brought us to where we are today in terms of the status of the region was the 1967 June War. The Israeli term for it is the Six-Day War. In that war, Israel conquers the Gaza Strip, conquers Jerusalem and makes Jerusalem whole and declares it their capital, and conquers the West Bank as well, and controls and occupies those areas as part of its policy. Palestinians remain in those areas as part of all these wars. You've had a number of refugees that have gone to Jordan, to Lebanon, to Syria, to Egypt and elsewhere, but also refugees within the territories of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Palestine, since that time, the Palestinian people have worked toward or want to work toward the achievement of a state and self-determination. The Oslo Accords were meant to provide some guidance on that and create some degree of autonomy for the Palestinian people in creation of the Palestinian Authority. But those accords have not been and were not as successful as they had hoped to be when they emerged in the 1990s.
Exactly. They certainly are. And we saw just recently, well, it's still going on right now. We saw this horrific conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and then, well, Hamas and Hezbollah to some degree. But as I understand it, there were like 80,000 Palestinians were killed in what is widely being called genocide. And of course, we saw where the International Criminal Court has labeled Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, as an international war criminal, which he well deserves, it looks like. So where are we today? And now we saw a big hoopla about a peace deal. Donald Trump was trying to get the Nobel Peace Prize. So he rallied everybody together and did this. It was really a faux peace conference. You come right down to it. And as soon as, even before they signed it, the ink was dry on this agreement. The Israelis were already violating it. Now it seems like both sides are doing it, but Israel is doing more of the violations. So where are we today?
Let me go back almost 2 years, or a little over 2 years now, to October 2023, when Hamas launched its attack into Israel, took hostages, killed many Israelis, and Israel responded with really a massive response into Gaza, advancing into Gaza. Hamas, for its part, emerged after the first Intifada in the late 1980s in Israel. It emerged out of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, which existed at the time. And Hamas has taken a rather strong stance on Israel. It doesn't believe that it has a right to exist, and it has been engaged in conflict with Israel. It's important to understand that Hamas is one small segment of the Palestinian people. Israel has used collective punishment, in essence, in its response to those October 2023 attacks. And in October 2025, the United States, and we should also acknowledge Qatar's role in this too, because Qatar played a really important role in brokering the ceasefire that took place. But the United States led a movement to broker a ceasefire between Hamas and the Israeli government. I think that ceasefire lasted maybe 2, 3 days total. And both sides started pointing fingers at the other, claiming that the truce had been broken. The Israelis claimed that the Palestinians, Hamas in particular, had not returned all the hostages' bodies. And the Palestinians then were met with the response by the Israelis, which have been drone strikes and continued conflict and violence and war with flare-ups by both sides. In essence, I like to equate what happened after October 2025 to the peace in our time language of the 1930s. You know, the United States declared peace in our time, a ceasefire was brokered, and everybody walked away from the table. Since that time and continuing, we have a number of crises that the peace process has not really dealt with. The most important one being a humanitarian crisis. I mean, there is a catastrophic situation on the ground in Gaza, destruction of homes, essential infrastructure in ruins, widespread displacement, severely limited access to food, medicine, fuel, clean water. Hospitals are short of supplies and fuel. And now you've got cold weather. People don't realize that this is a region that does get snow. It does get cold. And you've got hypothermia and other things causing problems for people. You have a large number of casualties, tens of thousands of deaths and injuries in Gaza, although the numbers are difficult to say because we're not getting entirely accurate information because the Israelis have prevented some of that. Amidst all of this, the United States has received UN support for this Board of Peace. The Board of Peace idea was an idea that a number of countries would come in and help guide, essentially, Palestinians toward government. The Board of Peace has a number of problems, though. For one thing, it's a pay-to-play Board of Peace. It'll cost a country $1 billion in cash, in essence, to be a member of the Board of Peace, and a number of countries have balked at this. They balked at it not simply for the cash amount, but the Board of Peace establishes the President of the United States, Donald Trump, as sort of the vicar of the Board of Peace. He's in charge of everything, and he can veto anything that happens. Meanwhile, he's given invitations to a number of countries that have caused controversy, including Putin's Russia, that Putin would be a member of this Board of Peace as part of the process. Israel is now balking at the Board of Peace because Trump reached out to Erdogan in Turkey and to Qatar to be on the board. Israel's particularly concerned about Erdogan and Turkey being a part of the board, in large measure because Turkey has referred to, not Turkey, but Erdogan has referred to Netanyahu as Hitler, and it has called him out for many of the things that you mentioned at the top of this question about war crimes and other things that have taken place. Turkey has also been closer with Hamas recently. But that closeness with Hamas, ironically, was also part of the reason why Turkey and Qatar could engage in putting some pressure on Hamas to bring them to the table for a ceasefire when the ceasefire occurred. So,
Yeah. The there's so many problems with this whole board of peace idea. First
mhm.
off, we've seen that the Trump administration is running a shakedown. I mean, really a kickback operation, and has been accused of selling pardons and that type of thing. I would think that the people who coming in or the countries coming in would think this is just a $1 billion contribution to Donald Trump's bank account. Now, I may be wrong on that, but that would, if I were a foreign leader, that's what I would think. Or I would think that he's going to use tariffs one way or the other to blackmail me or to bully me to do certain things. How do you
Yeah,
perceive?
this is one of the concerns by many of the states. The $1 billion initially, the idea was that this would go to Gazan infrastructure, rebuilding Gaza, which has really been leveled by the conflict and by Israeli actions. The problem is there are no guarantees about what that $1 billion is going to. Part one. The other problem here is that many would argue that the whole concept of this peace process was really a cover for Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu was able to come to the table and say, "Look, I'm making peace. Oh, Hamas broke the peace. Now I'm unleashed." And in many respects, the Trump administration has backed Netanyahu since that peace to say, if Hamas doesn't do disarmament, if Hamas doesn't come to the table and do what we want, if the Palestinians don't come to the table and do what we want, Israel will be free to respond. Um, all of the burden at the moment is on the Palestinians. And to add more irony and problem to this board of peace, Palestinians aren't involved in it. There are no Palestinians on the board of peace. And yet, this board of peace is going to conduct and tell Palestinian technocrats, essentially, a technocratic, bureaucratic government, what to do. So, the idea of self determination or even buy in from the Palestinians is weak. And now you have buy-in from the Israelis being weak because the Israelis don't like some of the countries that are going to engage in this board of peace. You're right earlier to say that much of this was being driven by sort of personal politics for Donald Trump and his desire to be seen as this grand peacemaker. Uh, for the ceasefire, he certainly deserves credit for helping to broker the ceasefire. The problem is that peace takes a heck of a lot more work than brokering a ceasefire. And since that ceasefire, we haven't really seen a steady engagement. And when the United States' credibility is also being questioned for a number of the actions we've taken in the world since that time, Venezuela, Greenland, these other things taking place, it makes us tougher to be an honest broker, to be a peacemaker in this conflict and actually engage in a way that other countries see as promoting a more global interest. The Board of Peace also undermines, or many people are criticizing it for undermining the United Nations directly, because it's setting up a parallel process where the United Nations is not involved. And, it's asking for donations. And keep in mind, the United States is a country that hasn't given its full budgetary contribution to the United Nations in a long time. And so that adds, I think, to a lot of the problems of credibility in this entire process related to peace.
It certainly does. And right now, the U.S. is $4 billion in arrears at the United Nations. So we're just on the verge of losing our vote in the UN General Assembly. We're going to come back and talk about that in a minute. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues. Today, we're taking a look at two hotspots, and two truly hotspots, and one is in between Israel and the Palestinians, and the other in Iran. And my guest today is an expert on both of these topics. Dr. Michael Cairo is a professor of political science at Transylvania University. Mike, we're talking about the United Nations being aced out on this. The UN has really tried to help keep the Palestinians alive, along with Ukrainians and many other people around the world, through its World Food Program, through the UN Refugee Agency, and just on across the board. But another key player was UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. That has been disbanded, has it not? Did the U.S. or
Essentially,
Israel did that?
essentially, yeah. I mean, it was providing a lot of refugee aid and refugee work within the borders of Gaza and the West Bank, and much of that work has ceased. In fact, much of the humanitarian aid is very limited in terms of what can go in or go out because the Israelis are controlling much of that, and the Israeli concerns with the ceasefire being broken have led the Israelis to revert back to that policy of limiting the engagement of the outside world inside Gaza.
Mhm. Well, as you look at the situation right now, what would you recommend? What can be done to defuse these problems, get the aid in, make sure that the Gaza area is not taken over and converted into a Mar-a-Lago of the East or something like that, and to help these people get back on their feet and eventually, hopefully, to develop a two-state solution there. How can we do that?
Well, I think right now we're at a very critical point. The United States has typically been the country, despite all the faults rather, and flaws associated with U.S. policy toward Israel and Palestine. The United States has typically been the country that has been able to engage and put some pressure on the various parties to move the peace process forward. As I noted earlier, the United States credibility is weakening. That weakening credibility affects our ability to influence and put pressure on these other parties. Add to that the United States engagement in this process is at best fleeting. We aren't sustained in terms of our engagement in any way. It seems like it comes up every now and then as an issue that the administration wants to engage in, depending on the personal proclivities of the president in the moment. You add to that the problem that a lot of countries don't trust that this process is really a process of peace. It makes it very difficult to revive or even move this process forward at all. At best, I think we need to push, and there needs to be a push for greater humanitarian assistance, for greater involvement by the UN directly on the ground in trying to deal with the various, really a humanitarian catastrophe, a catastrophe that is only getting worse every day. Um, and so at this moment, I don't know that much can be done about the actual peace process. Netanyahu seems rather unwilling to engage in it. The Palestinian people have no real interest in a peace process that cuts them out. The United States' engagement in this is more personal than in the interest of global peace or in the interest of the peace process itself as an end goal. And I think all those factors together make it very difficult for a peace process that is legitimate to move forward.
Mhm. Well, the United States has touted for years that we were a neutral broker, but that is off the table now. We are no longer a neutral broker. Well, it is a severe situation and one that's going to take a lot more input from more intelligent people than the ones who are dealing with it now. That's for sure. Well, Mike, I can't believe it. As always, we're almost out of time. We left 3 minutes for Iran. Can you give me
Okay.
just a little update on Iran here very quickly?
Yeah, we in Iran, you've had nationwide protests, largest protests really across the country since the 1979, 1980 revolution. These protests emerged mainly focusing on severe economic crisis in Iran, government mismanagement, corruption. This has moved from economics to some politics, with people wanting to see the end of the clerical regime in Iran. Um, and the Iranian government has responded quite forcefully in attacking protesters. As the outside world watches. One key thing that I'll say about these protests, a lot of people have suggested, oh, will this mean the collapse of the Iranian regime? The one key player that we're not hearing a lot about is the military. If the military and the Republican Guard, the Islamic Republican Guard that supports the regime, stay with the regime, it is highly unlikely you're going to see the collapse of the regime. And for the moment, that is where the military is. They're engaged in a lot of the persecution of protesters and engaged in putting those protests down. If that changes, that will be the tipping point, I believe, for something to change in Iran.
Certainly will. Now, a couple of months ago, the United States conducted a massive bombing campaign against what they thought were some of the nuclear sites. And
Hmm.
as I understand it, there were like 5 sites. I know President Trump said that we obliterated them. Well, all the experts have said no, they were not obliterated, that they
Yeah,
hit
at
two,
best we set them back a couple of
set
months.
them back. That was about it, but they were not obliterated. But of course, a lot of this goes right back to canceling the Iranian nuclear deal that President Obama had crafted with the Iranians, and then President Trump pulled us out of that back in well his first term, and
Hmm.
now we see where we are. And the Iranians were actually abiding by that nuclear deal, were they not?
Yeah, for the most part, that is true. And one of the things we have to keep in mind is when we back away from a country and we're not engaging with them in the same way that we engaged in the past, we lose the ability to really influence. President Trump seems to rely on airstrikes. Airstrikes are not going to change the outcome right now with the protests in Iran. Airstrikes didn't change the outcome with the nuclear program. In fact, it may have encouraged Iran to more rapidly advance toward nuclear weapons as a way to protect themselves. So we need to be careful about putting too much into the idea that airstrikes will somehow solve the solution or come to the rescue of those that we believe we should be rescuing.
Mhm. In certain cases, they can be a scalpel. In other cases, they can be a blunt-edged sword. And we really have to be very careful. You're absolutely right. Well, Mike Cairo, I want to thank you so much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.